The night Isabella was born, champagne bottles popped in a mansion so large you could get lost walking from one wing to another. Crystal glasses caught the light from chandeliers that cost more than most people earn in a year. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of money that builds hospitals and names them after you. Richard Whitmore paced in his study while his wife gave birth upstairs. Even on this night, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Another deal to close, another company to acquire. At 45, he'd built a pharmaceutical empire that made him one of the richest men in Manhattan, the kind of success that gets you on magazine covers and invitations to dine with presidents. His wife, Catherine, had been beautiful enough to grace those same magazine covers for different reasons. Before marriage, she'd walked runways in Paris and Milan. Now she organized charity galas where women competed over who wore the most expensive gown and who could write the biggest check while caring the least about where the money actually went. They already had twin boys, 8 years old, tucked away at boarding school in Switzerland. Brandon and Christopher came home twice a year, tanned and polite and speaking French better than English. Good kids, probably. Richard barely knew them. Catherine had wanted a daughter. One more try, she'd said, to complete the perfect family. And now Isabella had arrived. The first sign that something was different came in the delivery room. Babies scream when they're born. It's nature's design, that first cry announcing a new life. But Isabella entered the world in complete silence. No wail, no whimper, nothing. Just these huge dark eyes blinking up at the bright lights. The doctors ran their tests. They checked everything twice. Physically, the baby was fine. Healthy weight, strong heartbeat, all 10 fingers and toes. Some babies are just quiet, they assured the parents. Give her time. But time didn't change anything. Most parents treasure their baby's first sounds. The gurgles, the coos, those random babbles that don't mean anything but feel like communication anyway. Isabella made none of these sounds. She was 3 months old, then 6 months, then 9. She watched the world with those enormous eyes, taking everything in but remaining perfectly, unnervingly silent. When she was hungry, she didn't cry. She just stared until someone noticed. When she needed changing, same thing. When she fell and bumped her head learning to walk, she'd sit there with tears rolling down her cheeks, but no sound escaped her lips. It was like watching a television with the volume turned all the way down. Catherine started avoiding the nursery. She'd walk past the door, hear the silence, and keep moving. She hired a nanny, then another, then another. Each one lasted a few weeks before requesting a transfer to a different family. It wasn't that Isabella was difficult. She was actually eerily well-behaved. But the silence unsettled people. Babies are supposed to make noise. This one felt like a living doll. By Isabella's first birthday, Richard finally cleared his schedule long enough to take her to specialists. Not just any doctors, but the best in the country. The kind whose waiting lists were 6 months long and whose consultation fees could cover a year of college tuition. They ran tests that had names Richard couldn't pronounce. Brain scans, hearing tests, developmental assessments. Isabella sat through it all with that same quiet patience. Like a little old soul trapped in a toddler's body. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Harrison, a renowned pediatric neurologist, delivered the news in his corner office overlooking Central Park. Isabella had severe apraxia of speech, a neurological condition where the brain struggles to coordinate the movements needed for speaking. It wasn't that she couldn't hear or understand. Her brain knew what it wanted to say. The message just got lost somewhere between thought and speech. Could it be fixed? Richard asked. He was used to problems having solutions, especially when you could throw enough money at them. Dr. Harrison was honest. Speech therapy might help. Years of it. But many children with apraxia this severe never developed functional speech. Some learned to communicate other ways. Some didn't. There were no guarantees, even with the best treatment money could buy. Richard wrote a check for the first round of therapy sessions and went back to work. Catherine cried for one evening, then scheduled a spa weekend in Vermont. Neither of them knew what else to do with a daughter who couldn't talk. The therapists came twice a week, patient women with colorful toys and picture books, trying to coax sounds from a child who had none to give. Isabella would watch them intently, clearly understanding what they wanted but unable to deliver. After each failed session, she'd look frustrated, her little hands clenching and unclenching, but still always silent. The mansion grew quieter. Staff members whispered in hallways. The nannies changed every few weeks. Nobody cruel, nobody unkind. just people who didn't know how to connect with a child they couldn't hear. Isabella spent her days in a nursery full of expensive toys that nobody had taught her to play with, staring out windows at a world she couldn't participate in. Her second birthday came and went with a small cake the nanny made. Catherine was in Paris for Fashion Week. Richard was in Tokyo for a conference. The twins were still in Switzerland, probably learning to play polo or whatever rich kids did between Latin classes. Isabella sat in her high chair, looking at the single candle, and you could see something in her eyes, an understanding maybe that she was different, that something about her made the people who were supposed to love her disappear. By age 3, the speech therapy had been quietly discontinued. The therapists, for all their expertise and good intentions, had admitted defeat. Isabella had learned exactly 0 words. She couldn't even hum. It was like her voice simply didn't exist, but her mind existed. That much was obvious to anyone who paid attention, which admittedly wasn't many people. Isabella would organize her toys by color with meticulous precision. She'd spend an hour arranging her blocks in perfect patterns. She'd stand at her window and trace the shapes of clouds with her finger, clearly thinking about something, clearly processing the world around her. She just couldn't tell anyone what she was thinking. The nannies kept quitting. The 19th one left after 2 weeks, and the household manager, Mrs. Chen, was at her wit's end. She'd been managing the Whitmore estate for 15 years and had never struggled to staff a position until now. But keeping a nanny for little Isabella had become impossible. Nobody wanted the silent child. That's what it came down to. Isabella wasn't loud or demanding. She didn't throw tantrums or break things, but her silence made people uncomfortable. It reminded them of something broken that couldn't be fixed even with all the money in the world. Catherine had essentially given up. She loved her daughter in the abstract way you love an idea, but she couldn't bear to be in the same room with her. Every time she looked at Isabella, she saw her own failure. The perfect family portrait she'd wanted had a crack right down the middle, and that crack was this beautiful, silent little girl. Richard tried in his way. He'd stop by the nursery sometimes, awkwardly pat Isabella's head and leave again. He funded research into speech disorders. He wrote checks to organizations that studied childhood apraxia, but he couldn't figure out how to be a father to a daughter he didn't understand. The twins came home for Christmas that year. They were 10 now, almost strangers to their parents and complete strangers to their little sister. They'd look at Isabella with curiosity, like she was an interesting puzzle, then go back to their video games in their own world. Isabella would watch them, these brothers she didn't know, and you could see the loneliness in her eyes. She was 3 years old and already understood what it meant to be alone in a house full of people. The day after Christmas, Mrs. Chen sat in Catherine's morning room, tea growing cold in expensive china cups. They needed to discuss the nanny situation again. The 20th nanny had just given notice. She was a kind woman, Mrs. Chen explained, but she'd been offered a position with another family, a family with children who talked. Catherine sighed and said to hire whoever could start immediately. She didn't care about credentials anymore. She just needed someone, anyone, to look after the child so she wouldn't have to. Mrs. Chen took a different approach this time. Instead of going through the usual elite nanny agencies that catered to Manhattan's wealthy families, she contacted a smaller service. The kind that placed caregivers, who maybe didn't have fancy degrees but had something else. Experience, heart, grit. That's how they found Grace. Grace Thompson was 52 years old and had calloused hands from 5 decades of hard work. She'd raised 6 children in a small house in rural Georgia, working 2 jobs most of her life. She'd cleaned houses, worked in school cafeterias, done whatever it took to keep her kids fed and clothed and loved. One of those 6 children, her daughter Ruth, had been born deaf. Back then, Grace couldn't afford fancy specialists or therapy programs. She'd learned sign language from library books and taught it to Ruth herself. She'd fought with schools that wanted to put Ruth in separate classrooms and convinced them her daughter deserved better. Ruth was now a teacher herself, married with 2 kids of her own. Grace knew what it meant to love a child the world didn't understand. When Mrs. Chen interviewed her over the phone, Grace was honest. She didn't have a college degree. She'd never worked for wealthy people before, but she knew children, and she knew that every child could communicate if you just learned their language. Mrs. Chen hired her on the spot. Grace arrived at the Whitmore estate on a cold January morning. carrying one worn suitcase and wearing her best church dress. The house intimidated her. She'd never seen anything like it. But she'd cleaned plenty of houses in her life, and she knew that fancy furniture didn't make a home. People did. A staff member showed her to Isabella's room. The nanny who was leaving barely looked up from her packing. She pointed at the corner where Isabella sat, rocking back and forth slightly, and muttered something about good luck before hurrying out. Grace stood in the doorway and watched the little girl. 3 years old with dark curly hair and those huge eyes. She was rocking, just a gentle motion and staring at nothing. Her little hands were clenched into fists. This was a lonely child. Grace could see it in every inch of her small body. She didn't rush over. She didn't try to hug Isabella or force her to make eye contact. Grace had learned with Ruth that children who couldn't communicate in typical ways needed space and patience. Instead, she walked slowly into the room, sat down on the floor about 6 feet away from Isabella, and started to hum. No words, just a melody. An old hymn her grandmother used to sing. Isabella's rocking slowed. Just a bit. Her eyes shifted, not quite looking at Grace, but aware of her presence. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out something she'd brought from home. A small harmonica, dented and old. She played a few simple notes. Nothing fancy, just sound. For the first time in weeks, Isabella stopped rocking completely. She tilted her head, listening. Grace played another gentle tune. Then she stopped and just sat there, letting the silence settle. Isabella turned her head. Slowly, carefully, she looked directly at Grace, really looked at her, and Grace looked back, smiled softly, and thought to herself that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a child who needed exactly what she had to give. The house was still quiet.
Isabella still didn't make a sound.
But something had shifted in that room. Something small but important. It was the beginning of everything. Grace's first week in the Whitmore mansion felt like living in a museum. Everything was too clean, too perfect, too untouched. The kind of house where you were afraid to sit on the furniture because it looked like it belonged behind velvet ropes. But Grace wasn't there for the house. She was there for the little girl who spent most of her time sitting alone in a room full of toys she didn't know how to play with. Isabella watched Grace those first few days like a careful animal. Not scared exactly, but cautious. Waiting to see if this new person would be like all the others who tried too hard, got frustrated, and eventually left. Grace didn't try hard at all. She just existed in Isabella's space quietly, doing simple things. Folding laundry, humming old songs. Sometimes she'd pull out that harmonica and play a few notes. Other times she'd just sit by the window and look outside with Isabella, both of them watching the birds land on the bare winter branches. On the 4th day, something small happened. Isabella was sitting on the floor, organizing her colored blocks like she always did. Red pile, blue pile, yellow pile, everything in its place. Grace sat nearby, not interfering, just watching. Then one blue block ended up in the red pile by accident. Isabella stared at it, her little face scrunching up in distress. Her hand started to shake slightly, that frustration building with no way to release it. Grace leaned over slowly and pointed at the blue block. Then she pointed at the blue pile. She didn't say anything, didn't make a big deal of it, just pointed. Isabella looked at Grace's finger, then at the block, then back at Grace, and for the first time, she reached out and moved the block herself, placing it carefully with the other blue ones. Grace smiled and gave her a simple thumbs up. Isabella didn't smile back, but she looked at Grace for a long moment before going back to her blocks. It was such a small thing, but it mattered. They'd communicated. Without words, without sound. They'd understood each other. That night after Isabella was asleep, Grace sat in the small room she'd been given near the kitchen. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and comfortable. More importantly, it was close to Isabella's room, so she could hear if the child needed anything during the night. She thought about her own daughter, Ruth. How scared she'd been when she first realized Ruth couldn't hear. How helpless she'd felt. A young mother with no money and no idea how to help her baby. But she'd figured it out. She'd learned that communication wasn't just about sound. It was about connection. Isabella reminded her so much of Ruth at that age. That same look of being trapped inside yourself, of having so much to say but no way to say it. Grace pulled out her phone and started researching. She read articles about apraxia of speech. She watched videos of children with similar conditions. And then she stumbled onto something that made her sit up straighter. Sign language, not just for deaf children. Some speech therapists used it with kids who had apraxia, giving them a bridge to communication while they worked on speech. Or sometimes when speech didn't come, sign language became the communication itself. Grace knew sign language. She'd learned it 25 years ago for Ruth, and while she was rusty, it was still there in her muscle memory. Her hands still remembered. But would the Whitmores approve? She was just the nanny. She wasn't a therapist or a doctor. She didn't have credentials or degrees. Then again, all those credentialed people hadn't helped Isabella. The child was 3 years old and completely isolated in her own silence. What did Grace have to lose by trying? She decided not to ask permission. Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness. The next morning, Grace started simple. During breakfast, as she placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of Isabella, she made a sign, her fingers together moving in a circular motion near her mouth. The sign for eat. She said the word out loud too. Eat. And made the sign again. Isabella watched her with those observant eyes but didn't react. Grace didn't push. She just ate her own breakfast, occasionally making the sign when she took a bite. At lunch, same thing. The sign for drink when she offered Isabella juice. The sign for more when asking if she wanted another helping. For 3 days, Grace signed basic words while speaking them, not expecting anything in return. Just offering another language, another possibility. On the 4th day, during afternoon snack time, Isabella reached for the juice box. It was empty. She looked at it, then at Grace, that familiar frustration creeping into her expression. Grace held up another juice box. She made the sign for more and waited. Isabella stared at Grace's hands. Her own hands lifted slightly, trembling in the air. Her little fingers tried to mimic the movement. It wasn't quite right, kind of clumsy and uncertain, but it was unmistakably an attempt at the sign. Grace's heart nearly stopped. She kept her face calm, though inside she wanted to shout with joy. She made the sign again slowly, and handed Isabella the juice box. Isabella took it, and if Grace wasn't mistaken, the smallest hint of a smile flickered across the child's face before disappearing. That night, Grace cried in her room, happy tears, the kind that come from hope. She'd seen a door crack open just a little bit. Over the next few weeks, Isabella learned more signs. She was hungry for it, this new way to express herself. Hungry, tired, play, book. Her small hands moved with increasing confidence. Grace kept it quiet. The Whitmores barely came to Isabella's wing of the house anyway. Catherine was busy with her social calendar, hosting luncheons and sitting on charity boards. Richard left for work before Isabella woke up and came home after she was asleep. The household staff knew something was happening, but Grace asked them not to mention it to the family yet. She wanted to wait until Isabella was really ready, until the communication was strong enough that nobody could dismiss it. Grace also started something else. She used her own money to buy a tablet, one of those ones designed for kids. It had an app that let you tap pictures and the tablet would speak the words. A communication device. She'd read about them in her research. At first, Isabella just tapped random pictures, fascinated by the sounds that came out. But slowly, she started to understand. When she tapped the picture of an apple, the tablet said apple, and then Grace would give her an apple slice. Cause and effect. Communication and response. Within a month, Isabella was using both signs and the tablet to express herself. Simple things mostly. Want cookie. Read book. Go outside. But to Grace, each phrase was a miracle. The child who had been silent for 3 years was talking. Not with her voice, but talking nonetheless. Grace started documenting everything on her phone. Short videos of Isabella signing. Pictures of the tablet screen showing the sentences she'd created. She saved it all in a private folder, some instinct telling her she might need proof someday. The change in Isabella was remarkable. She laughed now, a silent laugh that shook her shoulders and lit up her whole face. She'd pull Grace by the hand to show her things. She'd use her signs to tell elaborate stories with her dolls, creating whole narratives. At night, Grace would sit on the edge of Isabella's bed, and they'd sign back and forth. Isabella would tell her about what she did that day, what she was thinking about, what she dreamed. All in signs and gestures and expressions. For the first time in her life, Isabella had a real conversation. And for the first time in 3 years, she went to bed feeling heard. Grace taught her other things too. They baked cookies together. Isabella following picture recipes that Grace made. They did art projects, getting paint everywhere and not worrying about the mess. They went outside and collected leaves, and Grace taught her the signs for different colors and shapes. The child was blooming. That's the only way to describe it. Like a plant that had been kept in the dark suddenly brought into sunlight. But Grace worried. She knew this couldn't stay hidden forever, and she knew that when the Whitmores found out there might be trouble. She was just the help. She'd overstepped her role. She'd made decisions about Isabella's care without consulting anyone. But she'd also given a little girl her voice back. That had to count for something. One afternoon, about 2 months after Grace had arrived, Mrs. Chen came to check on them. The household manager had been quietly supportive, keeping Grace's secret, but she looked nervous. "Mrs. Whitmore is coming home early today," she said quietly. "She might actually come upstairs." Grace felt her stomach tighten. Catherine rarely visited Isabella's room, but if she did today, she'd see everything. The signs, the tablet, the communication that shouldn't exist. "Should I hide the tablet?" Grace asked. Mrs. Chen thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, if she sees it, she sees it. This child deserves to be seen." Grace appreciated that. Mrs. Chen had watched 19 nannies come and go. She'd seen Isabella's loneliness. She understood what Grace had accomplished here, even if she couldn't say it out loud. That evening, Catherine did come upstairs. Not to visit Isabella, really, but to get something from her own room. But she passed by Isabella's door, which was open, and something made her stop. Grace and Isabella were sitting on the floor with a picture book. Isabella was signing to Grace, her little hands moving rapidly, telling a story about the pictures. Grace was signing back, both of them completely absorbed in their conversation. Catherine stood frozen in the doorway. She saw her daughter's hands moving with purpose. She saw the tablet nearby with its communication buttons. She saw Isabella's face, more animated and alive than Catherine had seen in 3 years. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Isabella noticed her mother standing there. Her hand stopped mid-sign. Her expression closed up, that guardedness returning. Catherine's face went through several emotions. Shock, confusion, and then something that looked almost like anger. She turned and walked away without saying a word. Grace's hands were shaking. She knew what was coming. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door. "Mrs. Whitmore wants to see you in her study now." Grace looked at Isabella, who had gone very still and quiet. She squeezed the little girl's hand, made the sign for okay, and stood up. As she walked down the long hallway to Catherine's study, Grace said a prayer. Not for herself, but for Isabella. Please don't let them take this away from her. Please let them see what she's accomplished. Catherine was standing by the window when Grace entered, her back rigid. She didn't turn around. "How long?" Catherine asked, her voice cold. "About 2 months, ma'am." "And you didn't think to inform me that you were teaching my daughter sign language?" Grace chose her words carefully. "I wasn't sure it would work, ma'am. I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up." Catherine finally turned around. Her face was perfectly made up, but her eyes were red. Had she been crying? "My daughter can communicate," Catherine said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word communicate. "My daughter, who every doctor said might never be able to express herself, can communicate. And I had to find out by accident?" Grace didn't know what to say. She'd expected anger, accusations, maybe being fired. She hadn't expected this raw emotion. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I should have told you sooner." Catherine laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You should have told me sooner, yes. You should have told me that the help succeeded where I failed. That a woman I'm paying $12 an hour did what I couldn't do. That my daughter talks to you but never talked to me." And there it was. Not anger at Grace, really. Anger at herself. Shame. The pain of realizing she'd given up on her own child, and someone else had stepped in and given that child exactly what she needed. The silence stretched out between them. Grace waited for the words that would end her time here. "Get out," Catherine finally said. "Just get out." Grace left the study and went straight to Isabella's room. The little girl was sitting exactly where Grace had left her, clutching one of her dolls. When she saw Grace, she signed quickly. "Okay? You okay?" Grace knelt down and hugged her, something she rarely did because Isabella didn't always like to be touched. But right now they both needed it. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Grace said, signing as she spoke. Everything's going to be okay. But she wasn't sure if that was true. She packed her few belongings that night, expecting to be asked to leave in the morning. What she didn't know was that downstairs, Richard had come home early for once. Catherine had told him everything. And for the first time in 3 years, they were actually talking about their daughter. Really talking. About what they'd missed, what they'd lost, and what might still be possible. Grace woke up the next morning expecting to be fired. She'd packed her suitcase the night before, said a quiet prayer, and tried to prepare herself for leaving Isabella. That was the part that hurt most. Not losing the job, but losing the little girl who'd finally found her voice. But when she went to Isabella's room at 7 like always, Mrs. Chen was waiting in the hallway. "They want to see you both," Mrs. Chen said. In the dining room, breakfast. Grace's stomach dropped. The Whitmores never had breakfast with Isabella. They never had any meal with Isabella. This couldn't be good. She got Isabella dressed, hands shaking slightly as she buttoned the little girl's cardigan. Isabella watched her face carefully and signed, "Scared?" Grace tried to smile. "A little bit, sweetheart. But we'll be okay." They walked down the long staircase together, Isabella's small hand gripping Grace's tightly. The dining room was at the end of another hallway, a room Grace had only seen while passing by. It had a table that could seat 20 people easy, with a chandelier hanging overhead that probably cost more than Grace had earned in her entire life. Richard and Catherine sat at one end of the table. They looked tired, like neither had slept much. There was food laid out, eggs and toast and fruit, but nobody seemed interested in eating. Grace and Isabella stood in the doorway waiting. "Sit down," Richard said. Not unkindly, but not warm either. Grace led Isabella to chairs across from them. The little girl climbed up and sat very still, her eyes darting between her parents like she was trying to understand what was happening. Richard looked at his daughter for a long moment. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. Then he turned to Grace. "Show me," he said. "Sir, show me what she can do. The sign language. I want to see it." Grace glanced at Isabella, who looked confused and nervous. Grace signed to her, asking if she was okay, if she wanted some juice. Isabella nodded and signed back. "Yes, please. Juice." Grace poured juice into a glass and handed it to her. Isabella signed "thank you" without prompting. Catherine made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. She'd pulled out her phone and was recording everything. Richard leaned forward. "Ask her something. Ask her what she wants to eat." Grace signed the question. Isabella looked at the food on the table, pointed at the strawberries, and signed, "Red berries, please." Grace translated out loud. "She wants strawberries." Richard pushed the bowl toward his daughter. Isabella took 3 strawberries and signed "thank you" again before eating them carefully. "What else can she say?" Catherine asked, her voice shaky. Grace pulled out the tablet from her bag. "She uses this too. It helps her make longer sentences." She gave the tablet to Isabella, who immediately perked up. Her small fingers moved across the screen, tapping pictures. The tablet's voice spoke, "Good morning. I like Grace. She is nice to me." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Tears started running down her face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Richard's jaw was tight. He looked angry, but Grace realized it wasn't anger at her. It was anger at himself. How long has she been able to do this? "She started with simple signs about 6 weeks ago," Grace said quietly. "But she's learned so much. She's very smart. She understands everything." 6 weeks. Richard said it like he couldn't believe it. "In 6 weeks, you taught her to communicate. We had therapists for over a year, specialists, the best doctors money could buy." Grace didn't know what to say to that. Sometimes the best help wasn't the most expensive help. Sometimes it was just someone who refused to give up. Isabella, sensing the tension, reached for the tablet again. She tapped carefully, creating a longer message. The robotic voice filled the quiet room. "I am sorry. I try to talk, but my mouth does not work. My hands work. Grace teaches me." Catherine broke down completely then. She buried her face in her hands and cried like Grace had never heard anyone cry before. The kind of crying that comes from deep guilt and regret and years of pain. Richard got up and walked to the window, his back to everyone. His shoulders were shaking. Isabella looked at Grace with wide, frightened eyes. She signed, "Did I do bad?" "No, baby," Grace said, signing as she spoke. "No, you didn't do anything bad. They're just sad they didn't know sooner." They're sad they missed so much, Isabella thought about that. Then she slipped off her chair and walked slowly to her mother. Catherine looked up surprised as Isabella stood next to her chair. The little girl reached out one small hand and patted her mother's arm, the way you might comfort someone who's hurt. It was such a simple gesture, but it broke something open in that room. Catherine pulled Isabella into her arms and held her tight, crying into her daughter's hair, saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. Richard turned back from the window. His eyes were red. "Grace, I need to understand something. Why didn't you tell us what you were doing?" Grace had known this question would come. She'd spent half the night thinking about how to answer it. "Honestly, sir, I was scared you'd stop me. I know I'm just the nanny. I don't have degrees or credentials. But I knew I could help her, and I was afraid if I asked permission, you'd say no and hire some expensive specialist who would take months to do what I could do in weeks. So you went behind our backs." "Yes, sir, I did. And I'd do it again, because that little girl needed someone to believe in her right now, not 6 months from now after committees and consultations and debates." The room went silent. Grace figured this was it. She'd just talked herself right out of a job, but she meant every word. Richard sat back down. "You're right. If you'd asked, I probably would have said no. I would have wanted to research it, consult with doctors, make sure it was the right approach." He laughed bitterly. "I would have wasted time we didn't have while my daughter stayed locked in silence." Catherine had calmed down enough to wipe her face. She was still holding Isabella, who seemed content to stay in her mother's arms for now. "What do we do now?" Catherine asked. "Now?" Grace said carefully. "Now Isabella keeps learning. She's hungry for it. Every day she wants to learn new signs, new words on the tablet. She's writing simple sentences. She's telling stories. She's got so much inside her that she wants to share. Can you teach us?" Richard asked. "The sign language?" Grace nodded. "Of course. It's not hard. Isabella learned it and she's 3 years old." "I want to learn," Catherine said firmly, still holding her daughter. "I want to talk to her. Really talk to her." Over the next few weeks, everything changed in the Whitmore house. Richard cleared his schedule, something his assistant said she'd never seen him do before. He came home for dinner every night. He sat with Grace and Isabella for an hour each evening, learning signs. His big hands fumbled at first, but he kept practicing. More, eat, play, love. Catherine canceled her social commitments. She spent her mornings with Isabella and Grace, learning alongside her daughter. She'd get frustrated when she couldn't remember a sign, and Isabella would patiently show her again. The little girl was actually teaching her mother. And something about that reversed relationship seemed to heal them both. The twins came home for spring break and were shocked to find their parents actually home, and their little sister talking through her hands. Brandon, the quieter twin, took to sign language immediately. He thought it was cool, like a secret code. Christopher was more skeptical at first, but even he came around when Isabella signed that she wanted to play superheroes with them. For the first time ever, the Whitmore house felt like a home. There was laughter in the hallways. Isabella's tablet voice could be heard throughout the day as she asked questions, told jokes, and demanded more cookies. Grace watched it all with mixed feelings. She was happy, truly happy that Isabella had her family now, but she also felt herself becoming less necessary. Catherine was learning fast, spending more and more time with Isabella. Richard was devoted, making up for years of absence, which meant Grace might not be needed anymore. One evening, about 2 months after that breakfast meeting, Richard asked to speak with Grace in his study. Her heart sank. This was it. The gentle dismissal. "Thank you for your service. Here's a nice severance package. Goodbye." She sat in the leather chair across from his massive desk, hands folded in her lap. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Grace, Catherine, and I have been talking. We need to make some changes. Here it comes," Grace thought. "First, we're increasing your salary. Significantly. You're not just a nanny. You're Isabella's teacher, her advocate, and honestly, you're the person who saved her life. $12 an hour is insulting," Grace blinked. "Sir, you don't have to." He held up a hand. "Second, we want to make your position permanent. Not just employment, but legal. We want you to have educational guardianship over Isabella, meaning you have a say in her schooling, her therapy, any decisions about her care. We trust you in ways we don't even trust ourselves." Grace couldn't speak. She literally couldn't find words. "Third," Richard continued, "there's a guest house on the property. It's been used for storage, but we're renovating it. We want you to have it. Your own space, your own home, but close enough to Isabella. I don't understand, Grace finally managed. Why would you do all this? Because you gave us our daughter back, Catherine said from the doorway. Grace hadn't heard her come in. Because you saw value in her when we only saw problems. Because you loved her when we didn't know how. Catherine came and sat in the chair next to Grace. I've been a terrible mother. I know that now. I was so caught up in appearances and what people would think that I forgot to actually be a mother to the child who needed me most. I wasn't much better, Richard added. I threw money at the problem and called it parenting. We can't undo the past 3 years, Catherine said. But we can do better going forward. And we need you to help us. Isabella trusts you. She loves you. You're her person. Grace felt tears stinging her eyes. She's my person too. So you'll stay? Richard asked. Yes, Grace said, not even having to think about it. Yes, I'll stay. That night, Grace told Isabella about the new arrangement. The little girl signed excitedly, asking questions faster than Grace could answer them. Would Grace live in the house with her? Could she decorate her own place? Would she still see her every day? Yes to everything, Grace signed back. Isabella threw her arms around Grace's neck and held on tight. When she finally let go, she picked up her tablet and tapped out a message. You are my best friend. I love you. Grace signed it back. I love you too, sweetheart. The months that followed were good ones. Isabella's communication skills grew every day. She started writing more, creating little stories on her tablet that she'd share with the family at dinner. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about expressing them anymore. The family started doing things together. Movie nights where Isabella would sign commentary through the whole film. Weekend trips to museums where she'd ask a million questions. Birthday parties where Isabella was the center of attention, showing other kids how her tablet worked. She still couldn't speak with her voice. That part of her hadn't changed and probably never would. But she didn't need to speak. She had other ways to be heard, and that was enough. Grace moved into the guest house in late summer. It was small but perfect, with a little garden she could tend and a front porch where she could sit in the evenings. But most of her time was still spent with Isabella, teaching her new things, reading together, just being together. One afternoon, they were sitting under a tree in the backyard, the tablet between them. Isabella was unusually quiet, thinking about something. Finally, she tapped out a message. Why did you help me? Other people left. Grace thought about how to answer. Because you deserved someone who wouldn't leave. And because helping you helped me too. You reminded me why I love what I do. Isabella smiled and signed. You're not my nanny. You're my Grace, and that was exactly right. Not a nanny, not an employee, not the help. Just Grace. The woman who'd seen a silent child and heard her anyway. The woman who'd given a little girl the tools to speak her truth even without a voice. Everything seemed perfect. The family was healing. Isabella was thriving. Grace had found a home, but nothing perfect lasts forever. And sometimes the biggest challenges come right when you think you've won. The problem started with something small. At least it seemed small at first. Isabella was 4.5 now, thriving in ways nobody had imagined possible. She was writing short stories on her tablet, creating elaborate art projects, and had even started learning basic math. Grace worked with her every day, and the family had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Then Catherine got a phone call from her sister, Diane, who lived in Boston. Diane was coming to visit for a week, bringing her daughter, Victoria, who was the same age as Isabella. Grace had never met Diane, but she'd heard enough from the household staff to know the two sisters were competitive. Everything was a contest between them. Who had the better house, the more successful husband, the more accomplished children? Diane arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a car that probably cost more than Grace's childhood home. She swept into the mansion with her daughter trailing behind, all blonde curls and designer clothes. Catherine, darling, Diane air-kissed her sister's cheeks. The house looks wonderful. Though I must say our renovation in the Hamptons turned out rather spectacular. You'll have to visit. And so it began. Victoria, the daughter, was a tiny terror wrapped in pink ruffles. She talked constantly, showing off her vocabulary and her ability to read simple books. She played piano, apparently. She spoke a little French. At 4 years old, she was already being groomed for excellence. Isabella watched this small whirlwind with curious eyes. Signing to Grace. She talks a lot. Grace smiled and signed back. Yes, she does. That evening at dinner, Diane finally acknowledged Isabella's existence. So this is the youngest one. She's quite pretty. It's such a shame about her condition. The table went quiet. Richard's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Catherine's face tightened. Isabella doesn't have a condition, Catherine said carefully. She has apraxia. She communicates differently. Diane waved a hand dismissively. Yes, I know. Sign language and that little computer thing. Catherine, you mentioned it on the phone. It's very sweet that you've adapted, but surely you've looked into more intensive therapy. There are facilities in Europe that specialize in these sorts of problems. She's not a problem, Richard said, his voice hard. Grace, sitting at the far end of the table where the staff ate during family meals, watched Isabella's face. The little girl understood everything. Her hands had gone still, her expression guarded. Of course not, Diane backtracked, but not sincerely. I just meant that Victoria here is in an accelerated preschool program, already reading at a second grade level. I'd hate for Isabella to fall too far behind. Catherine looked like she wanted to throw her wine glass at her sister. Isabella is exactly where she needs to be, but the damage was done. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Isabella crawled into Grace's lap in the guest house, something she rarely did anymore. She'd brought her tablet. She typed slowly. Am I behind? Am I broken? Grace's heart broke a little. No, baby, no, you're different, not broken. You're learning things at your own pace, and that's perfect. Victoria talks. Her mouth works. Yes, her mouth works differently than yours. But you know what? You notice things Victoria doesn't. You're kind in ways she isn't. You create beautiful stories. You have so much to offer the world. Isabella thought about this. Then she typed, Aunt Diane thinks I'm wrong. Aunt Diane, Grace said carefully, doesn't understand. Some people only see one way of being right, but there are lots of ways to be right. Isabella seemed to accept this, but Grace could tell the seed of doubt had been planted. The rest of the week was torture. Diane made constant comparisons between the girls, always with Victoria coming out ahead. Victoria could do this, Victoria had accomplished that. And every comparison was another small cut to Isabella's confidence. Catherine tried to shut it down, but Diane was relentless. She'd been doing this their whole lives, apparently, always competing, always needing to win. The breaking point came at the end of the week. Diane was finally leaving, bags packed and loaded in the car. She was saying goodbye to Catherine in the foyer when Isabella came down the stairs with her tablet, wanting to show her mother something she'd written. Oh, she's still using that device, Diane said, not quite under her breath, but not quite quiet either. Have you considered that maybe she's becoming too dependent on it? Victoria's friend had a speech delay, but with the right therapy, he's speaking now. Maybe if Isabella tried harder. Get out, Catherine said. Diane blinked. Excuse me. Get out of my house, now! Catherine, I'm only trying to help. You're not helping. You're being cruel. You always have been. Everything's a competition with you, and you know what? I'm done. I don't care if your daughter reads at a college level. I don't care if she speaks 5 languages. My daughter is perfect exactly as she is, and I'm not going to let you make her feel less than. Diane's face went red. Well, I can see where your priorities lie. Good luck with that. She grabbed Victoria's hand and stormed out. After the door slammed, Catherine stood there shaking. Then she noticed Isabella on the stairs watching. Catherine went to her daughter and knelt down. I'm sorry, she signed, still clumsy with the gestures but sincere. I'm sorry I let her say those things. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are exactly who you're supposed to be. Isabella hugged her mother, and Catherine held on tight. But that night, Grace found Isabella sitting in her room, crying those silent tears that shook her shoulders. The tablet was on the floor and she'd thrown some of her books across the room. Grace sat down next to her. Want to talk about it? Isabella's hands moved in angry, frustrated gestures. I hate this. I hate not talking. I try and nothing comes out. Why? Why is my brain broken? Your brain isn't broken, sweetheart. It works differently. That's not the same thing. Everyone else talks. Victoria talks. The twins talk. Mom and Dad talk. Even babies talk. But not me. Never me. Grace pulled Isabella close. You do talk. Maybe not with sound, but you talk. You tell me things every day. You tell your parents things. You wrote that beautiful story about the bird finding its family. That's talking. It's not the same. No, Grace admitted. It's not the same. And I know that's hard. I know you wish your mouth worked the way other people's mouths work. But Isabella, listen to me. Your worth isn't in your voice. It's in your heart, your mind, your spirit. Those things are perfect. Isabella leaned against her. After a while, she signed, "Does it get easier?" Grace thought about her own daughter, Ruth, who was deaf. She remembered Ruth at this age asking similar questions. It gets different. You'll learn to be proud of who you are. You'll find your people, the ones who see you for you. It won't always hurt like this, promise? Promise. They sat together in the quiet for a long time. The next few weeks were rough. Isabella withdrew a little, her confidence shaken. She still used her signs and her tablet, but she seemed less eager, more self-conscious. Catherine was devastated that her sister had caused this setback. She and Richard talked about getting Isabella into therapy. Not to fix her, but to help her process these feelings. They found a therapist who specialized in children with communication differences. Dr. Lisa Chen came to the house twice a week. She was a small woman with kind eyes who used sign language fluently. At first, Isabella was resistant. Another adult trying to help, another person who would eventually give up or leave. But Dr. Chen was patient. She didn't try to change Isabella or make her talk. She just helped her understand her feelings. One session, about a month in, Dr. Chen asked Isabella to draw how she felt. Isabella drew a bird in a cage. The cage door was open, but the bird wasn't flying out. "Tell me about this bird," Dr. Chen signed. Isabella typed on her tablet. "The bird can leave but doesn't know how. Everyone says she can fly, but she doesn't believe them." What would help the bird believe? Isabella thought for a long time. Then she typed, "Maybe seeing other birds like her. Birds who can't sing but still fly." Dr. Chen smiled. "That's very wise. Would you like to meet other kids who communicate like you do?" Isabella's eyes went wide. "There are others? So many others. Kids who use tablets like yours. Kids who sign. Kids who use picture boards. All kinds of kids who are different and amazing." That conversation changed everything. Dr. Chen connected them with a support group for families with nonverbal children. Once a month, they'd meet at a community center. There were about 15 kids ranging from age 3 to 10, all with different reasons for not speaking, all with different ways of communicating. The first meeting, Isabella clung to Grace's hand, nervous. But then she saw another little girl about her age using a tablet just like hers. The girl came over and typed, "Hi, I'm Zoe, want to play?" Isabella looked up at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. She typed back, "Yes, I'm Isabella." And just like that, she had a friend who understood. Grace watched from the side as Isabella and Zoe played together, both using their tablets to chat, both signing when their hands weren't busy with toys. They didn't need words to communicate. They understood each other perfectly. Over the next few months, these meetings became the highlight of Isabella's month. She made friends. Real friends. Kids who didn't think she was weird or broken. Kids who celebrated when she learned a new sign or wrote a funny sentence on her tablet. One boy, Oliver, was completely nonverbal and used only picture cards to communicate. But he was hilarious, creating elaborate jokes through his pictures that had all the kids laughing. Another girl, May, was deaf and used sign language exclusively. She taught Isabella some signs Grace didn't know, and Isabella taught her some back. These kids were thriving. They were happy. They were whole. Isabella came home from each meeting more confident, more herself. She started creating a blog on her tablet, writing about her experiences as a kid who didn't talk. Her parents helped her post it online, and other families started reading it, commenting, sharing their own stories. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. There was a whole community of kids like her, and they were all okay. One evening, about 6 months after Diane's terrible visit, the family was having dinner together.